Good morning and a Freilich and Chanukah, 7th day of Chanukah. And we continue our journey, Ayin Beis, volume 3. We finished page 1271, Aleph Resh Ayin Aleph. But let me go over it a little more detail. So I want to go back to page 1211, where the Rebbe Rashab first introduced Gan Eden. And I want to go and summarize it a little more detailed, because I think we'll understand better what we're learning now if we understand what it says back there. So just to give you context, the whole volume 3 began on page 1207. So 4 pages into it, 1211, after stating the idea of Ein Oid, that the very letters of the Rishimu, the very Kalim themselves, the darkness itself will radiate and reveal divine energy, not just Havayu Elikim, that Elikim is revealing the Oir of Avaya. But Einoid, then on page 1210, he began with Havaya Yachatu Merivov, with a bunch of questions that will not be answered till later, till page 1287. We're now 1271. But then, L'hovin Kol Zeh, on page 1211, he began another subject matter. At the time, it seemed also random, even though it was clear that it would all build up to a bigger picture. But at the time, it didn't seem like there was connections. Now, some of the connections are beginning to emerge. So he said, to understand all this, we have to understand L'hovin Kol Zeh Tzarich L'hovin HaHefresh ben Gan Eden le'Olam Habo, between Gan Eden and Olam Habo. So I want to sum up what we learned on page 1211, 1212, actually all the way till the bottom of page 1218, where then he finished with Gan Eden and left some questions hanging, then went into the whole discussion of the whole maturation and development of human emotions and Avodah as we grow in our relationship with God, and then bring it back to Gan Eden. So I'm now going to see the connection of it all. What did he say back then on page 1211? So I'm not going to read inside. I'll just sum up key points to refresh our memories. So the first thing he started was the difference between Gan Eden and Olam Habo. Now, what does that mean? Many people think Olam Habo and Gan Eden are synonymous. But even though there is an opinion that Olam Habo means the world to come is Gan Eden, what is that? The souls, after they finish their work in this world, where do they go? The next world, Gan Eden. But the main Olam Habo is Tchias HaMesim, in the future. So we really have like two Olam Habo, so to speak. One world to come that follows the work of a neshama in this world and actually precedes the work. Where neshamas are right now, where neshamas live, they reside in Gan Eden. They come to this world. That's where they ascend. They're sent from Gan Eden to this world. And in Gan Eden, there are many levels. Gan Eden Atacht and Gan Eden Elyon. We'll mention that shortly. They come to this world. They finish their work. And when neshama goes back after Me'ev Esrim Shana, after 120 years, it returns to Gan Eden. And there it benefits from the Ziva Shechina, from the reflection of the Shechina that was a result of their work in this world. But as we learned, Gan Eden also has a state before any avodah. God created a Gan Eden even before souls were there. Before Adam and Chava were created, there was already a garden of Eden. And then they were placed in this garden. So as we learned that length, Gan Eden is a higher level than other worlds, a higher spiritual level, and then it becomes even greater through our avodah. So on page 1211, he began saying exactly that. He said, Dehini Yadua. I'm just going to cite key lines just to keep the flow, and I want to make the connection to what we're learning now. So he says, Dehini Yadua, the Gan Eden nimshach teisvus tamid ayidei ma'aseh mitzvos be'olam hazeh. In Gan Eden, there's a constant flow of additional and abundant and increased energies that are result from the work of the mitzvahs we do in this world. Dafke. Kasher nasim b'kavanah v're'usa deliba. Very key line. When they're done with intention and re'usa deliba, the desire of the heart, which in general encompasses all the kavanahs that we've been talking about. Ava, yira, loving God, the reverence of God, the higher levels of ava, ava rabba, ava b'tainugim, even simcha shal mitzvah. I'll soon get back to that. So that's the first statement that he makes. That's Gan Eden. Now, even though he doesn't say it right away, what's the difference between Gan Eden and Olam Habo? He will say in the next page or two, on 12:11, 12:12, Olam Habo is different than Gan Eden because Kol Yisrael Yesh Lem Chelik Le'Olam Habo. The Mishnah says everyone has a part in the world to come, even if you didn't do Avodah. Gan Eden, only when you have Avodah you have a part in Gan Eden, and without it, maybe you have from previous generations and previous souls. But Gan Eden's power is all driven by spiritual energy and vitality that comes from Kavanah. And I'll elaborate on that in a moment. Olam Habo, on the other hand, neshamas begufim, if you just did the Maisa HaMitzvah, even without Kavanah, Kol Yisrael, everyone has a part in that world, even if you just did the action. So now comes a discussion, the difference between the action of a mitzvah and the Kavanah of the mitzvah. So again, I'm going to refer to key lines, and you'll see where it's going in a moment, and it'll all set the stage for everything we've been learning about Gan Eden, especially the last paragraph that we finished on Friday. So he continues. Like it says by Adam Arishan, again, I'm reading key lines. Like Adam Arishan, we see clearly he was placed in the Garden of Eden to serve and protect. And what is la'avdol l'shamar ramach mitzvos shasa mitzvos leisasa? The 248 positive mitzvahs and 365 negative. Beruchnius, as he's going to explain shortly. But it's through Avodah. He did Avodah in the garden. And he says clearly, through that created an abundant energies in Gan Eden, more than Gan Eden on its own. Even though in Gan Eden, even prior to human being, prior to Adam, there radiates a Gili like it says, Vayita, Havaya Elikim Gamba Eden, Havaya Elikim, Shem Mole. Not just Elikim, Havaya Elikim, higher than, let's say, Breshis Bar Elikim, the rest of the world. So the entire planet is created by Elikim. Garden of Eden is planted by Havaya Elikim. So it's higher than regular Elikim. Nevertheless, so two things. That Gan Eden is a higher energy than the rest of the worlds, and in the rest of the worlds, it's concealed in Gan Eden. It's real. Nevertheless, again, I'm reading from the middle of page 12:11. That to be additional energy there, you need Aveda. And here he gives the example. Aveda Sagan, who the working a garden, who should yeser. Why do we work a garden? Why don't we just let the garden grow things on its own? Why do we need to Aveda? Because we want it to really grow in a far better and more improved way. This is called tzmicha b'tev yeser, a higher quality harvest and growth. And what is the work in the garden? L'sakel havonim, to remove stones, ulahashkes sagan, and to irrigate and nurture and nourish the garden. If you just let the garden go on its own, it would become weeded. The stones would block the healthy growth. So you need to remove something, which is like surmara, like leisase, and lahashkes, and you need to water and nurture it. You don't water a garden, you don't irrigate it, it will wither. Kamoy Kain, he says, same thing in the Nimshal, in the moral, that through the Aveda Mitzvos Leisa said, just to stay away, to refrain from certain behavior. And Mitzvos to do certain things through that is drawn an abundant and increased energy in Gan Eden, just like it is when you tend to a garden and you manage a garden, right? The reason I'm reading this is because it's so vital to understand the whole concept. Okay. And then he continues and says like this, and that's the difference between the neshamas before they came down to this world. Before they came down to the world, it's Gan Eden on its own. There was no Avodah. The Gan Eden was created by God. I'm talking about the heavenly Gan Eden. And the neshamas are placed there. There's no Avodah. The Avodah there is they're just benefiting from the garden. They're learning Torah. But that's before. Then when the neshamas come to this world and they work this world, then that means that they're producing more than the garden has on its own. That's the abundant net. Okay, stop here. So that's the definition of Gan Eden. We understand now Gan Eden before Avodah, after Avodah, and what its primary role is. Now he's going to say, and this now becomes much more alive once we've learned everything we've learned. The energy that we generate in Gan Eden through our Avodah, what kind of energy is it? Is it a Mamala Kalaman? Is it Sevav Kalaman? Or is it Atzmus? We know these three expressions because we've learned them. Mamala Kalaman is the energy within existence. Sevav Kalaman is the transcendent energy above. And Atzmus is the Etzem that we learned that you reach through Maisa HaMitzvos, through action. So now he's going to address this issue here. And this is all in the beginning of the subject matter. But now we'll understand it much deeper. I remember when we learned it, I don't know if you recall, there were things here that were not so clear. And I said, once we get back to it later, I'm sure this will become clarified. And now it does become clarified. So the first thing that Rabbi Rashab establishes now, which at the time when we learned it wasn't clear, why is he focusing, but now it's very clear. So he says like this Yesh Lemer is very vital. So I'm reading on here. He says like this. U'makom mokim Yesh Lemer, even though Avodah increases the let's call it the produce and the harvest of Gan Eden by adding new energy through the mitzvahs we do in this world. Yesh Lemer, he says, nevertheless, Yesh Lemer, one can say, Shagilu ba'isa mahus. The Gili, even that which comes from Avodah, is still the same personality, it's still the same paradigm as the energy in Gan Eden before the Avodah. The Hainu, Hakol Hagili de Mamal Kalam. We're not creating an energy in Gan Eden that's beyond the structure of Gan Eden. In Gan Eden, the garden is now producing more. We haven't transformed the garden. God created a garden, Havaya Lakim. What we're doing is instead of just the garden producing the minimal amount, or not producing because if you don't tend to the garden, it can be overgrown and lose its vitality. What we're doing is we're increasing energy, but it's still Oisei Mahus. So the same personality, which means Mamala Kalalmin, Shazewa Gilid de Gan Eden. That's the Gilid of Gan Eden. Gan Eden is Mamala Kalam. The only difference is that the Gili now through Avodah is at a higher level than it would have been without Avodah. Without Avodah, the garden would be certain nominal or minimal amount. Avodah makes it grow much more. That's the first statement he makes. This is going to be critical to our whole discussion of what the difference between Gan Eden, Olam Habo, and other things that we've learned. Now, I know you're probably thinking, didn't we learn that we get Atzmus HaTainug in Gan Eden? Atzmus? So what is that? Well, hold on, you'll see. So far, that's what he's established. Now, the parentheses, and I went over it, I'm going over it in detail because I think a lot of the details here are very relevant to what we're going to learn. That's why I'm elaborating more than usual on something we learned in the past, because it's almost like he's tying up, he's concluding that which he began here. In the parentheses, the Rebbe Rashab goes a little detail of what exact Gili is Gan Eden, what level is it exactly? In the spheres, where would we place Gan Eden? Before Avodah and after Avodah. We know now it's Mamalakam. We know it's in, we're soon going to learn that Gan Eden is in Bria and Yetzirah, or sometimes Bria and Asiya. We know that. We'll soon learn it. He'll soon spell it out. But what spheres in those worlds is Gan Eden involved with? So he says like this, that in Biyuri HaZeyar, Mashma, the Hagili the Gan Eden Mitzanatsu B'chinas Keser Chochma Bina of Malchus. So from there it appears That Gan Eden on its own, not through Avodah, is Keser, Chachma, Bina of Malchus. Rak shezeu k'moshe mekabelas mizah b'bchinas acher ba'acher. So it's the highest levels of Malchus, but it's the way it's receiving from Zah. Which remember, Zah is higher than Malchus. Zah is the Mashpia. Malchus is the Mekabel. It's receiving from Zah, Acher ba'acher, back to back. Now you may recall that. Remember, Yichud Abba v'Ima Eloyin, Yichud Abba v'Ima Zivuge Shlim. A full union is Panim b'Panim. Acher ba'acher is Yichud Abba v'Ima, is Yichud, that's not Panim b'Panim. Actually, I should correct myself. We're not talking about Abba v'Ima now. In Zah, if you recall, there's the Yichud of the Zah that is like Acher ba'acher. When Adam and Chava were created, they were back to back. It's only after they were separated that they become Panim b'Panim, face to face. So Gan Eden on its own is Keser Chachma Bina Malchus, receiving from Zah, but back to back, which is one of the 7 levels that we learned of Aliyas HaMalchus, if you recall, the 7 levels from Eitz Chaim. This is one of the lower levels. I think this would be, let me just see, I think this is, either level 2 or 3. Yeah. So if you recall, when he spoke about the sun and the moon in Eitz Chaim, there's 7 levels of Yichud Zah and Malchus is sun and moon. So you could have a complete new moon, which is a diminished Malchus, and it's not receiving anything from the sun, only maybe a dot. Then you have where the moon is receiving from the sun, but from the lower levels. But it's still like back to back. And then like the full moon is the moon facing the sun face to face. Just to refresh your memory. So bottom line is, what he's saying is Gan Eden is the level of Keser Chachma Bina of Malchus, but it's receiving from Zah, Acher ba'acher, back to back. Okay. Now, that's Gan Eden on its own. What is Gan Eden after Avodah? Once Adam and Chava work the garden, now Malchus is looking at Zah face to face. It's still not higher than Zah. And it's still not like an equal. Well, Panim b'Panim could be, I think Panim b'Panim, let me see a second, could be lower. Yeah, Panim b'Panim could be lower, and then it could also be higher. So bottom line is what's been achieved now is that you've achieved a higher level of Yichud, a Yichud Panim b'Panim. That's one thing he brings in the parentheses. The second thing he brings from the Kutei Torah, from Bamidbar Sin Be'al Meid, the Gan Eden on its own is Bria of Bria, the world of Bria of Bria. And he says, Yesh Lemer, this is the Keser Chachma Bina of Bria. So he's reconciling with the first statement. Is the Keser Chachma Bina of Bria, which, as he says in Eitz Chaim, is the Teferes Netzach Yisei the Malchus Meir B'Keser Chachma. Yeah, that Teferes Netzach Yisei the Malchus Meir B'Kachab the Bria. So it's a little lower level, but it's still Keser Chachma Bina of Bria, which receives from the Teferes Netzach Yisei the lower levels of Malchus. So basically, 2 ways to explain Gan Eden on its own. It's either Keser Chachma Bina of Malchus as receiving back to back from Zah, or it's Bria of Bria, Keser Chachma Bina of Bria, as it's receiving energy from the lower levels of Malchus. That's Gan Eden on its own. The Avodah of Gan Eden elevates it to a higher level, but it's all within Mamalo Kalam. Even the higher level is face to face, but it's still within the same paradigm, the same domain. You're still talking about the same Zah and Malchus. You've not transcended Atzilus. You're still talking within the structure of Bria, of Atzilus, whatever the levels he's describing here. Okay? Fine. Now comes the next part. The next part, a little confusing when we learned it, but now it's clear to me, at least. Now he says, Ivadai, that the mitzvahs that Adam HaRishon did were not physical. The kiyum mitzvahs doesn't lo yoy mitzvahs gashmis Chassidus and tefillin shalanu. And you have to say la'avda ramach mitzvah sesa is beruchnius, as they are mitzvahs havai and atzilus. So now the next point here is that the work of Adam HaRishon was definitely spiritual, not physical. He didn't do physical mitzvahs. And then he continues, Kiyadua, that similar to this, were the mitzvahs of Avram Avinu. But it says, Kayim Avram Avinu kol ha-Torah, and all the other verses that he says that he did mitzvahs, it's how he did them in the root of these mitzvahs, the way they are above in Ruchnius. So now he establishes clearly it's all in Ruchnius, which we learned also here. We'll get back to it later. Okay. So now, here's going to be the dilemma, as you'll see in a moment. Now that we know they're doing it by Ruchnis, okay, so the Ruchnis adds energy to Gan Eden, very clear, fine, no problem. So now he says, before he continues, he says, brings proof that they're doing Beruchnis. How do you know they did it Beruchnis? The Eichef Shalomer Shekai Mitzvahs Film B'Dalet Parshas Kishalonu Sheniska B'Mitzvahs Mitzrayim. Because how can you say that they performed the mitzvah of tefillin with the Dalet Parshas, the 4 chapters, like ours, which mention the Exodus from Egypt? The Exodus of Egypt didn't happen yet. So there's no way that Avram Avinu could have put on tefillin with these Dalet Parshas like ours. Now, he may have put on tefillin in a spiritual way, but it's definitely not the physical tefillin as we put them on with the physical parchment, physical chapters written on the parchments in our tefillin. It says clearly, Dal Pasha Shalanu Sheniska B'Hem Yitzis Mitzrayim. Ukahai Gavna Kol HaMitzvahs Shen Zech Litzis Mitzrayim Oishatluim Ba'aretz. The same thing with all the mitzvahs that are commemorating the Exodus from Egypt, or that are dependent on Israel, like Shemitah, or Meiser, Truma. All the laws that are dependent on being in Eretz Yisrael could not have been done by them because they didn't yet have the Eretz Yisrael. Adam HaRishon for sure not. He was never in Israel. He was in Gan Eden. And even Avram for all those years that he wasn't in Israel. And either way, it did not have the laws that we have after Matan Torah. So what did they do then? So what does it mean that they performed all the laws and the mitzvahs? They perform them all as they are in their root above in Atzilus. So now Rabbi Rashab asks a question. If that's the case, we have a question here. So according to this, we have to understand what is this thing called receiving reward in this additional energy that's generated in Gan Eden through their avodah. The lechera ina be'erach klal leimer shemegashmis hamitzvus ketfilin v'tzitzis b'tzemer v'klaf hagashmi yim is a taste for seir eliki began Eden shu betachlis haruchnis. What's the connection? If you're talking about ruchnis dika work, so ruchnis dika work generates ruchnis dika energy in Gan Eden. But how you explain that we're doing mitzvahs here, physical mitzvahs, gashmis, tefillin, tzitzis, with wool and with parchment, how will that cause, how does that cause additional spiritual energy in Gan Eden, which is utterly spiritual? There's nothing physical about Gan Eden. If you don't say that is the ruchnis of the mitzvahs that increase these energies in Gan Eden. In other words, what the others did makes sense. But how do our Maisa mitzvahs have to do with Gan Eden? Maisa. So he's going to obviously leading to explain that's why Maisa mitzvahs is not enough. You need Kavanah. Our Kavanah is the ruchnis of the mitzvahs. Now he adds in a parenthesis, which I think is also important to mention. Before I do, I want to just stop here a moment. Is everyone following? Because I'm going back much earlier, so I want to make sure everything is clear. If something's not clear, please stop me here.
Everything's very clear. It's very helpful, and the connections are starting to come from everything we've learned. I had one small question, and you don't have to answer it if it throws you off, but what does it mean, Bria Sheba Bria? I understand Malchus Sheba Chochma, Chochma Sheba Malchus, but what is a world within a world?
I thought we had learned that at length. I explained everything in the Shtalshlus is like a hologram, meaning everything encompasses everything. Just like there's a Chochma within Chochma, there's an Atzilus within Atzilus, there's Bria in Atzilus, there's Yitzir in Atzilus. Because remember, we're dealing with spiritual levels. So like Atzilus and Atzilus is the Yud of Yud Ke Vav Ke. The Hey in Atzilus is the Bria within Atzilus. The Vav in Atzilus is Zah in Atzilus. And the last Hey is Malchus of Atzilus. Same thing in Bria. There's Atzilus within Bria, there's Bria within Bria, there's Yitzira within Bria, and there's Asiya within Bria. It's simply different levels within levels.
I got it.
Gan Eden is like, for example, the rest of the world of Bria would be Yitzira and Asiya of Bria. Whereas Bria of Bria is like the Kesser Chochma Bina, the highest level of Bria would be called Bria of Bria. Chochma of Atzilus would be called Atzilus within Atzilus. Bina of Atzilus is called Bria within Atzilus. Remember, the spheres also correspond with the worlds. Abba Mekanano Ba'atzilus, Chochma is dominant place. It nests in Atzilus. Bina Mekanana B'Kursaya. Bina nests primarily in Bria. Zah primarily in Yitzira, and Malchus primarily in Asiya. So when you take all that, everything overlaps with everything.
Got it. Thank you very much.
Okay. Now the next parentheses is again, I am specifically stopping on every important point. So now he goes back to the previous parentheses somewhat, but here's an interesting point he's going to say. Ukiyadua al kavonas ha-mitzvah, on the intention of a mitzvah, which is not physical, hakabol escharu b'Gan Eden elyon. The reward for kavanah is in the higher Gan Eden. V'al ma'isa mitzvah saschar b'Gan Eden atach. And the actual ma'isa is schar is in Gan Eden atach. So in other words, when you do a mitzvah, there's two parts. There's the actual doing it, then there's the concentration of the kavanah. The kavanah could be, I'm doing it because God wants me to do it. I'm doing it in order to be mamshich, like tefillin, Shabbat, shibud haleva amoyach, to bind mind and heart. There's a kavanah. You can just do it mechanically without any intention, or you could do it lishma, which means the kavanah. There are different levels of kavanahs, which we'll soon talk about a bit as well. So it says the kavanah is mamshech in Gan Eden elyon, and the ma'isa is mamshech in Gan Eden atach. Now that doesn't answer the question. That just makes the question stronger, because we still need to know, how does action generate spirit? Basically, they're two different worlds. Spirit generates spirit. So kavanah in Gan Eden elyon, fine, but ma'isa mitzvah in Gan Eden atach. What does that mean? And then, as it seems to me like an aside, but I guess it's important. He says in Likutei Torah of the previous parentheses, it says. This is, it's a little twist here, so keep in mind that Gan Eden Atachten through Avodah. Remember, we talked there's Gan Eden without Avodah, there's Gan Eden with Avodah. Gan Eden Atachten through Avodah is higher than Gan Eden Elyon on its own. So Gan Eden Elyon on its own is a certain level, like we learned, Keser Chochma Bina of Malchus or Bria of Bria. Then when you do Avodah, even Avodah, the Gan Eden Atachten through Avodah is higher than Gan Eden Elyon on its own. But he doesn't spell out what that means. We have to look it up in the Likutei Torah. Now, why is he mentioning it here? I had this problem when we learned it the first time. I'm speculating now. The reason he's mentioning it is because he wants to say that the schar mitzvah of Ma'isa mitzvahs Gan Eden Atachten would be higher than Gan Eden Elyon on its own. Not sure. I'll leave that. I'm not sure why he's adding this, but he does add it. Now, the next page 1212, I'm continuing the summary here. So now he says, V'hu iker hagabol eschar. And that's the main primary reward in Gan Eden, Ruchnius. So the question remains, how does the Ma'isa mitzvah generate Ruchnius when one is utterly spiritual and one is physical? So now the Rebbe Rashab says like this. In truth, he's going to now turn the whole thing over. Still not answering the question, but he's going to turn everything over now. Ube'emes, and in truth, lo yala ruchnis nistavinu. The fact is, fine, you've answered the question that if the Ovis and Adam, their Aveda and Ruchnis cause-generated Ruchnis. That's fine. But that's not the Kavanah. Be'emes lo yala ruchnis nistavinu. We were not commanded to do spiritual work. Rak lases b'poel mamash dafke. Our command, Torah Mitzvos, is to do it in action. If a person said, instead of me putting on tefillin, or instead of tzitzis, I'm going to do what Adam Arishan and Avram did, that's not the Kavanah. They, first of all, had no choice. They didn't have yet physical mitzvahs. Secondly, that was their work, the Ruchnias. But that we weren't commanded the Ruchnias. We were commanded to actually do it. And Bezeh, listen to these words. And in this, Yesh Yisrin Maila Lebonim Ala Ovis. This is a quality that the children have over the Ovis, over the patriarchs. Because they did not do it begashmis. Like it says in Parsha Ve'era, when Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu, "V'shmi Havaya lo nadaiti lahem." My name Havaya, I did not let them be. I did not make them. I did not reveal myself. I did not let them know me with the name of Havaya. I only knew them with the Shem Shaddai. In other words, the Ovis did not have a gilui that now the God revealed to Moshe and to the Jewish people as they were leaving Mitzrayim, as they were going to leave in Mitzrayim and exiting Mitzrayim and going to Matan Torah. A new gilui, Shem Havaya. So we clearly see we have something that the Ovis did not have. Because the Ovis did not have physical mitzvahs, only spiritual ones. He brings the same ones we learned the other day. Inviting guests, digging wells, umakles, the rods, the sticks, the rods that Yaakov used when he bred the sheep. So the Rebbe Rashab is clearly saying these are spiritual. Later we learned, if we remember Friday, we learned that also has some tfisa, has some touch of physical. It's not completely spirit. It has something, but it's not primarily that. If you remember on page 12, going back to where we are, 1271, he said, so they did do something, but you can't compare the maklis, for example, the rods, to actual tefillin, with the mitzvah of tefillin. We today cannot use rods to put on tefillin. There's a certain way to put on tefillin. And the same thing with the other things. So they definitely affected the physical world. Listen, when Avram invited guests to his tent, it wasn't a spiritual thing. He fed them food and drink, and they participated. There was chesed begashmi is being done. But it's not the mitzvah of achnas sarchim as it is after Matan Torah, where the mitzvah is specifically dafke and gashmis and transforming gashmis. So I can explain more of the difference, but I think it's pretty clear. And also the chfiras be'eris, the digging of wells, was, even though they physically dug a well, but it represented a spiritual activity. Today, we don't have a mitzvah of digging wells. We have the idea of removing blockages and revealing ur. But generally speaking, theirs was much more symbolic. The physical part was more symbolic, except the one mitzvah of bris milah, because there God gave Avram a ferish, a mitzvah, umaltem as b'sar levavchem. They should actually physically circumcise. And Ataka says in Sfarim, and Chassidus especially, that bris milah is like a mitzvah from after Matan Torah, because it actually was not a spiritual thing. It has spiritual energy, but its main primary thing is a physical circumcision. Okay. So therefore, so the mitzvahs were given gashmis, b'peil mamish. Im kain, hari ikra kabol schar hu al ma'aser b'peil mamish dafke. So then, on the contrary, the primary reward is on peil mamish, on doing a mitzvah. The Ovis before Matan Torah, the Ovis, Ad Marishan, their work was spiritual. So Gan Eden made sense. But here we're talking about mamish. Im kain eichu hakabola schar began Eden b'chinas eir haruchni ala mitzvah al shala mitzvah ala ma'aser shala mitzvah shehi l'mayla ma'aruchni shala. So before the question was, how does a physical act generate spiritual? It's two separate realities. Now he's going further. The contrary, the gashmis is higher than the ruchnis. So how could you have reward in Gan Eden of a ruchni, a maisa, which is much higher than the ruchnius in it. It's true the kavanah of the mitzvah generates ruchnius, but the primary mitzvah is the action. As we'll learn in a moment, action, the kavanah without action, you did not do the mitzvah. So what's the connection? What's the relationship between a Gan Eden that is spiritual and adding increasing energies there with a mitzvah that's gashmis, that's higher than the spiritual? Ukamayim Razal, he brings proof. Schar mitzvah. The word of a mitzvah is the mitzvah itself, not the spiritual. Mitzvah hainu etzema mitzvah atzma. The very mitzvah you do, that's its reward. And now you tell me the reward is a spiritual energy in Gan Eden. So now the Rebbe Rashab, the next paragraph, he's going to start answering the question. But as we'll see shortly, it's not completely answered until we get back to where we are right now. Because remember, the whole topic of Kalim and Maisa reaching Etzem has not been addressed at all. That's going to be a key element to all of this. But we also have to understand Gan Eden. If you recall, it's not just having Etzem, we need the Etzem Begoli. So I think it's vital to keep that in mind, that Gan Eden is going to serve the goal of Ruchnius, because it's not just enough for us to do physical mitzvahs. We want also to be Kalim for the spiritual, that the divine revelation of Gan Eden should also be part of us, but we want to also reach higher than that. That's what we learn now, what we're up to now in 1271, where we have the Maila of both, the Maisa mitzvah and the Kavanah mitzvah. So I'm just pointing that out so you'll understand the next paragraph better. But again, if anybody has any questions so far, what I've summed up, please, because now he's going to go a little further now into this. He's going to say, 1 second here. Seemingly there is an answer to this question. Okay. So now,
when you said that Gan Eden Elyon, Gan Eden Atachton with a vote is higher than Gan Eden Elyon on its own. Your Gan Eden Atachton is the level of Gan Eden Babria. I mean, but Yetira?
where do you see that? He didn't discuss it yet.
No,
All he said was that Gan Eden is Bria of Bria or Kesach Chachma Bina of Bria.
No, you just said a few minutes ago. Gan Eden Atachton.
We'll get to it. When he gets to it, I'll get to it. He didn't say anything yet about it. The next page, on page 1213, he's going to speak the difference between Gan Eden Elyon and Gan Eden Atachton, okay? But I just wanted to go in order of the Rebbe Rashab's order here. On next page, 1213, he's going to speak about that, okay? Did you hear me? Okay.
Yes, I heard.
Good. So we'll get to it shortly. Just hold on. Now he says, now interestingly, this is not so common. A paragraph begins with a parentheses, and the parentheses ends within the paragraph. So that's just an interesting, I have not seen that so often. Okay. So now the Rebbe Rashab qualifies and says, basically, why can't you say, the Rebbe Rashab is going to ask, that now Maisa mitzvahs, when you do an action, it's true that we need to understand the relationship. How do we, it seems like there's a distant, there's nothing similar between the action of a mitzvah and the ruchnis of the Tesus Ser and Gan Eden, but the fact is Hagvagam that they Maisa mitzvahs nimshar gam ken Tesus Ser began Eden atach al kaponim. We said before, if you remember the bottom of last page, that the Maisa mitzvahs, the schars and Gan Eden atach. So to say, why can't you say when you do a mitzvah, it's true, the Maisa mitzvah and the ruchnis don't have much in common. But why can't you say that the Eibishter made it that when you do a mitzvah, it triggers a spiritual energy? In Gan Eden Atachna at least. Not Gan Eden Elyon, fine, because it's much higher. But at least in Gan Eden Atachna, Sheyesh B'zeh Gam Ken Yisra and Kanal. It also has this Yisrael. What Yisrael does he mean? I'm trying to wonder what Yisrael this is. Which Yisrael does he mean? Yisrael. I'm not sure what he means by the Yisrael. He means either the Yisrael that it has both the quality of Gashmis and Ruchnius. Or maybe he means that the avodah with Gan Eden Atacht makes it higher than Gan Eden Elyon. Not sure. Anyway, he refers us back to a Maimon that talks about the difference between Gan Eden Elyon and Gan Eden Atachten back in the volume 2. There he simply talks about two spiritual levels. If I recall
correctly,
correctly,
isn't he just talking about the Yisron of the Banim ala Avos, that we have tangible mitzvahs, so to speak, and they don't. So we have something to hold on to add energy that the Avos didn't have.
yeah, but why would he say it here? Why is it relevant to this line here?
Talking about the energy you get out of doing mitzvahs.
Yeah, but he's talking about the energy in Gan Eden. So why would he be focusing on the mile of Gashmis? I think he means the Yisrael that Gan Eden Atachten with Avodah is higher than Gan Eden Elyon on its own. That's what I think he means. The one on the bottom of page
1211.
1211. I think that's what he means, but I can't say for sure. Because then you have, in other words, the Maisa Mitzvahs are creating something in Gan Eden that's powerful. Maybe. I'm not positive. I just want to see one thing. 1 second. On page, I'm going back to volume 2, 1054. Aleph Nun Daled. Yeah. Yeah, he says the difference between Gan Eden Elyon and Gan Eden Atachten, there's the difference between Bina and Malchus. You may remember also when he spoke about the Nahar Dinur, that from Gan Eden Atachten to Gan Eden Elyon, you have to go through another Amud, another transition. Okay, fine. So the Rebbe Rasham now says, Nira, it appears, Nira means it appears to me, the Pshat here, the Hamshachas Ha'er B'Gan Eden, that this Hamshacha we're talking about, the energy in Gan Eden, Hagam Shazal De Maisa Mitzvah, even though it's generated and caused by the action of the mitzvah, Kavanah Levad, and with intention alone, if you, God forbid, did not have the action of the mitzvah, lo yamshich klum, you would not draw anything. V'lo yikabel shum schar, and you would not receive any reward. V'adarabah, on the contrary. Why? Because you did not do the mitzvah. So you transgressed a mitzvah. Except he's qualifying him qualifying unless it was a situation where he was forced, God forbid, so he's unable to perform the mitzvah. If you're unable to perform, is another story. Then you're you're absolved of the mitzvah if you can't do it. But if you could have done it and you only did the kavanah and not the mitzvah, you don't have any reward and nothing is nimshach at all. So you must have the action. But nevertheless, Mekol Mokim, this is a chiddush the Rebbe Rashab is explaining, Tolei hamshacha b'hakavona she'im ha'maisa. So even though, yes, you cannot have that schar in Gan Eden without the maisa, but the hamshacha of the ruchnis in Gan Eden is dependent on the kavanah that comes with the maisa. The kasher maisa mitzvah b'kavanah. When you do the mitzvahs with intention, oz dafke nimshach ha'idei zeh tesvuser b'Gan Eden. Dafke then you have the transmission of this abundant, this increased energy in Gan Eden. I just wanted, before I read further, but if you have the Maisa without Kavanah, he's going to say you don't have Gan Eden. You don't have the schar and the in Gan Eden. So what he's saying in this parentheses is fascinating and also very relevant to what we're going to learn, or what we have learned and will learn, is that what the vart is like this, that Gan Eden is Ruchnius. So Ruchnius is generated by Ruchnius. However, because the mitzvah is to do it, you have to do the mitzvah. But the Gan Eden part comes through the Kavanah. So you have to have the Maisa and the Kavanah. Maisa alone, you'll not have the Gan Eden part. You'll have Olam Habo that we're going to learn in a moment, because you did the mitzvah. But without the Kavanah, you don't have the Ruchnius. Without the Ruchnius, you don't have the schar that he's talking about. On the other hand, only the Ruchnius doesn't have anything. So you need Maisa and Ruchnius. So now he's going to say,
but you get the lower Gan Eden just from mice. It seemed to me without, and because then he further said that it's higher only if you add Kavanah.
No. He's going to say now that you need the Maisa alone without any Kavanah. You will not get even Gan Eden Atachten.
But he just said schar mitzvah. He just said schar mitzvah.
Let's finish reading and you'll see what he's going to say. Schar mitzvah doesn't mean Gan Eden. That's you get reward for doing a mitzvah. Who says that's Gan Eden? It could be higher than Gan Eden even, because a Ma'isa mitzvah has power. Let me finish reading. 1 second. You'll see. So now he's going to say, so there's two. Now he's going to speak about a second level of Kavanah. So you have to have Kavanah. Through that you get Gan Eden. Ukashar Kavanah hi alpi hasod. He's now going to be quoting. This is quoting Tanya chapter 41. When the Kavanah is deeper, it's alpi hasod. In other words, it's not just the general intention that you're doing with Kabbalah soil. I'm fulfilling God's mitzvah. Asher kedeshanu b'mitzvos tzivanu. I'm doing the mitzvah not mechanically. I'm not doing it just for myself. I'm doing it for God. So that's already a kavanah. When the kavanah is al pi hasod, hapnimi sheba mitzvah, that the intention goes deeper into the secret of this mitzvah, the sod pnimi sheba mitzvah, uba'aveda haproti shebachol mitzvah, and the specific aveda that each mitzvah accomplishes. Kamoi, an example, the shabbat haleva hamoyach b'mitzvahs tefillin. Like, not just you're putting on tefillin because God said you should do so. You're actually concentrating on the kavanahs, the deeper meaning in what? In binding your mind and your heart. Ukahai gavna b'chol mitzvahs, and similarly b'chol mitzvahs. So you're going into a kavanah pnimis and say what he calls apiyasad apnimi, and the kavanah and aveda pratis. Then you know what you do then? You're not just mamshecher and Gan Eden atachten. Mamshichim tesvus began Eden elyon. Mamshichim tesvus began Eden. Then you draw energy also into Gan Eden elyon. Ukashar kavanah hirak b'bchinas kabbalah sel malchus shamayim. When the kavanah is only that you're accepting the yoke of heaven without these details, I'm skipping the parentheses for a second. Mamshichim tesvus began Eden atachten. Then you draw down energy in the lower Gan Eden. And the parenthesis he adds, in chapter 41, in the beginning, you need both intentions in doing a mitzvah. The general that God gave you a mitzvah, you're doing it because God said do this mitzvah. And the kavanah pratis is laniach tefillin, the specifics about what is tefillin mamshich and how you bind your mind and your heart, or whatever the details are. The first kavanah brings the mamshich erin Gan Eden atachten. The second kavanah is mamshich erin Gan Eden elyon. But here's the punchline. Aval bli kavanah klal, But if you don't have any intention at all, like the sinners among Israel that are filled with mitzvahs, like a pomegranate, like the Gemara says in Chagiga, they do not draw energy, increased energy in Gan Eden. Now, Gan Eden remains as is. They have not added to Gan Eden. Okay. Now, it's pretty strong stuff here. We learned it already, but now it's coming alive much deeper. And we're soon going to understand this much more, what the reason for all of this is. But now you see here that even though he said Maisa Mitzvahs is going to cause energy, because you need the Maisa, or else you don't generate anything. If God says you should do a mitzvah and you don't do the mitzvah, it doesn't matter. All the kavanahs, you need the mitzvah. The mitzvah is that presses the button. The kavanah is what's mamshir the in Gan Eden. The kavanah klal is kabol sel machshman in Gan Eden atachten, and the kavanah prat is what he calls api asad in Gan Eden elyon. And it makes total sense because the Maisa mitzvah reaches the etzem, as we're going to learn in a moment. The kavanah reaches the giluyim of the seder shtalshus. And we said before, Maisa and seder shtalshus don't have anything in common. The physical world fulfills dira b'tachtenim, which means a dira for atzmos, but all the giluyim of Atzilus and Bria and all the revelations of Gan Eden, for that you need spiritual, you need the neshama of the mitzvah. Remember, a mitzvah without a kavanah is like a goof without a neshama. So the goof you have, no problem, you fulfill the goof. But if you want the neshama, which is what Gan Eden is about, you need a kavanah. That's essentially what he says there in Tanya, but he's definitely spelling it out here very, very specifically. Okay.
Giga talks about sinners of Israel in the pomegranate. I didn't even know.
The Gemara says, "Afilu Peishi Yisrael, even Peishi Yisrael, which means sinners in Israel,
I thought it meant plain. I didn't
mitzvahs
realize
kerimai, are filled with mitzvahs like a pomegranate is filled with seeds." What's your question?
Oh, that you transferred Peishi Yisrael as sinners. I didn't.
Sinners in Israel. Exactly what I said. Peishi Yisrael are sinners in Israel. That is what it means.
Could have just been regular. Okay.
Which means basically that even though what he's really trying to say is that even though they have mitzvahs, but they don't have kavanah. That's what he's trying to say. In other words, they have mitzvahs, but they don't have kavanah. V'zeu ha'hefresh, and this is now the difference between Gan Eden and Olam Habo that he began last page. What's the difference? The Olam Habo, which is Tchias HaMeis in the future, Hu al etzem asiyas ha'mitzvahs. That is a result of the actual performance of mitzvahs. U'lechein kol Yisrael yashlem chelik le'Olam Habo. That's why you say kol Yisrael have a share in the world to come. The Gan Eden, and the reward in Gan Eden, however, hu dafka ala ma'aseh im hakavana, is specifically on the action with the intention. So Olam Habo is not dependent on the intention. Gan Eden is dependent on the intention. And what's the reason for it now? What's the reason? So this brings us back to what we said before. Remember, we said that even the increased energies that come through Avodah is still the same quality of Mamal Kalam. Gan Eden has not been catapulted to another reality. It's the paradigm of Gan Eden. It's just the garden now is abundant with fruit and produce and offspring. So he says this is the difference. Why? The reason for this is the Liyasha Gili de Gan Eden, who are the Mamal Kalam, since the revelation of Gan Eden is a of Mamal Kalam that fills and permeates and is revealed in the world, because Mamal Kalam is a divine energy that's revealed, that exists within every entity. It's not a divine energy that transcends, like Sevav Kalam or Etzem. So since it's a Malkam, that's why the primary Amshach is through Avodah Ruchnis. Whether the Avodah Ruchnis of the Ovis and the other Marishim before Matan Torah, or our Kavanah. The madregas mamal kalam yesh hefresh ben ruchnis legashmis. Because in the level of mamal kalam, there's a difference between spirit and matter, between the spiritual and the physical. And therefore, even though by Gan Eden you also need Maisa, you also need Maisa. Okay. You also need Aveda Ruchnis. Because in Mamal Kalam, you can't have Mamal Kalam absolutely makes distinctions between levels. So if you just did the action, you wouldn't get a Gili of Elikus. You wouldn't have Mamal Kalam. Mamal Kalam, there's a distinction between the physical and the spiritual. And therefore, there's a hierarchy, a gradation, so to speak. And yes, so there's the difference between Ruchnis and Gashmias. So therefore, you need the Ruchnis to be Mamshach Ruchnis. Yeah. Whereas in Olam Habo, he's going to say it afterwards. Yeah, he's going to say, we'll say it in a moment. He's giving now a second reason why Gan Eden is dafke through Aveda Ruchnis. Oidzos, he says, and additionally, the begili zeh haritzorich li is keli ela oir. In the gili of Mamal Kalam, you need to have a keli to the oir. So the keli the begili zeh haritzorich li is keli ela oir. The beginning Mamal Kalam has a beginning oir bekeli. Mamal Kalam is an oir in each keli. The etzem ha'maisa shel ha'mitzvah ain't b'chinas keli ela oir. An action is not a keli to an oir. An action is a specific thing God wants you to do. For example, when a student is learning with a teacher, there it's a keli and an oir. The student has to be a receptacle that's receptive to receive the intelligence that the teacher is imparting to him. But then let's say, at the end of the class, the teacher asks the student, go bring me a cup of coffee. He's giving him a mitzvah, so to speak, an action. That's not a keli to the oir, because there he's fulfilling what he's told to do. So it has a powerful element, like we're going to learn, mitzvahs reach deeper than keli and oir. But if you want a keli and oir like Gan Eden, you need to be a keli to it. And that's why you need to have the Kavanah. Let me explain it for a moment. The Gemara says, Ashrei mi sheba lekan v'talmudei biyodei. That in order to go into Gan Eden, you have to have talmudei biyodei, which means that's the word I want to say. He has knowledge of Talmud stored within him. He's armed. That's the word. He's armed with Talmud. Let's say, for argument's sake, you wanted to join a class, an advanced class in Nigla, Chassidus, whatever, but you're not really a keli to it. You like the idea. You come into the classroom. What'll happen? You don't understand a word. It's in a language you don't understand. It's being taught in a way that's over your head, etc. So Maisa HaMitzvah doesn't require such a keli. The Rebbe says, do a mitzvah. It doesn't matter, man, woman, child, a scholar, no scholar. It's an act. Everyone can do an act. But when you need Gan Eden, is not about an act. Gan Eden is about an experience. So you can come into Gan Eden, and why you don't have Gan Eden, it's not a punishment that you're not getting Gan Eden. You're just not capable. If you don't have the kelim. So if a person did mitzvahs in this world but never did a kavanah, with what they don't have the tools and instruments with which to go into Gan Eden. So Gan Eden is Mamal Kalam, and point number one, that it's a distinction between Gashmis and Ruchnis, therefore you need to have Ruchnis to go there. It's not an equalizer, there are distinctions. And number two, everything functions there like an and a keli. So since it's like a keli ala so he explains, Etzem Maisa is not a keli to Kamesha Kosa b'mokam acha b'in hamshachas ha'atzmus. Elsewhere, it's explained that if you want hamshachas ha'atzmus, not oir, atzmus, that's dafke with a physical thing that's not a keli. A keli to an Eir is like the Eiris and Kelim of Atzilus, of Bria, Yitzir, and Asiya. Gashmius is the diametric opposite of Ruchnius. Like what the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, but Tachtonim, it's the lowest level in Gilead. There's no Gilead Lakus here. You can't say this world is a Keli for a Lakus. You can make it a Keli through Kavanah, like we'll talk about and we're going to discuss. But the very physical world, physicality, Gashmis is not a Keli to Ruchnius. Gashmis is a connections to Atzmus. Atzmus wants Dafka Gashmis. We're going to learn that Gashmis has a neshama beguf. Therefore, there's also a kavanah in the mitzvah, and therefore there's a Eir and Keli in a mitzvah too. But the pure raw act that God wants us to do, why does He want an act? It would seem to make sense. Like in chapter 36 in Tanya, he says, why do we know the kavanah is dira b'tachteinim? Maybe the kavanah is not silas. So he says, Hoyel ulahem yiridim me'er panav yizbarach. Because those higher worlds are all a descent compared to Atzmus. Why would He need it? Atzmus is higher than Atzilus. Why would He need to reveal Himself in Atzilus? Tachteinim doesn't have anything that's in common. It's not higher or lower. God wants it. It's not a world that has spiritual revelation. It has no quality. So the only thing it has is God wants it. That's it. So it's not in the form of an Eir and a Keli. It's simply Hamshachas Atzmus and Maisa Mitzvah. The action of a mitzvah is not berech to be a keli. A keli is a student to a teacher, something incommensurate between you and the thing that you're receiving. But here we're talking about a pure action. It's not a keli to rotzen elyon. Ubezed dafka nimshacha etzem harotzen. And dafka there you have etzem harotzen that's higher than all the Eiris and Kelim and Giluyim. Well, l'chein be'elam haba. So Gan Eden, which is Eir and Keli, you need to have Keli and Eir. You need a Kavanah. You need Ruchnius. But in Olam Habo, Shu Gili B'chinas Eir and Sof HaSevev. Sevev is not. Is number one. There's no hierarchy of Gashmis and Ruchnius, and there's no Eir and Keli. Harizeh Ayideh HaMitzvah Atzmo HaMaisa Atzmo. That's where Olam Habo is generated through the action itself. It doesn't require any quality. It doesn't require any spiritual dimension element to it. Aval Gan Eden Shazel Gil B'chinas Mamalakam and Sodichli is Kavanah Ima Maisa. But Gan Eden, which is Mamalakam, needs to have the intention with the action. Now, obviously, our goal is to have both, but he's distinguishing and dissecting it simply for us to be able to understand and make sense of this. Okay. Now, that was a pretty heavy piece, even though we learned it. You may remember it, but now I think we understand it a lot better after everything we've learned, and I will still bring it back to where we are, because he's going to explain at the end, remember, that the mitzvah itself reaches etzem, remember? But simcha shal mitzvah and avar rabba, the tanugim, and all the giluyim of b'chol meidecha and mesiras nefesh, and all that which is necessary before you have simcha shal mitzvah, that all brings it into giluyim, into keli to the eir. Because at the end of the day, we want both. We want etzem, but we want to also have the element of being a keli to the eir. Ein oid, as we're going to learn, is the etzem. It's the very existence touching the etzem of Elikus, whereas Havayu Elikim is still eir and keli, more or less. And that's what we're ultimately going to learn about. The Oisiyas Sarashimu, the Sheresh HaKelim, remember, is all the way in the etzem. That's why it's so vital, because he asked, how do you reach the etzem? Through a Maisa mitzvah. That was the whole discussion that we had. Because the idea of Simcha Shal Mitzvah broadens the boundaries. It breaks through and then extends, but it's still ultimately Kalim. So now you're beginning to understand how Kalim are rooted higher than Eir is so vital to this discussion here. They'll say, what about Kalim higher than? Remember, there's a Keli to the Eir, and there's the very Keli itself is the power of Koyach HaGvul that comes from Atzmus Sumhus Ein Sof. So we're not talking about Keli now as a Keli to the Eir, you're talking about the very Keli, the Maisa, touching the Etzem. As we'll learn more as we go on. But I want to stop here if anybody wants to ask anything. There's more I want to review before we go back to where we're up to, but I think this review, as you see, is quite vital. No questions? Okay.
I have a question, if no one else does. It seems like because Gan Eden, there's a difference between Olam Habo and Gan Eden. Gan Eden is a sort of a repository storage of the merit, the energies of fulfilling a mitzvah with ruchnius, with kavanah. So it almost seems like it's very personal. Like, what's its function in the larger evolution of the world, into the idea of bringing Elokus into this Gashmi, into this lower world. It seems like it's almost happening on two tracks. Like the first track is, let's say, the main track of bringing godliness into Gashmias, which is the last thing you started talking about. But then there's this other track about increasing energy in Gan Eden, this other world, and it's very personal to your particular, the way you do mitzvahs, and someone else who doesn't do a mitzvah with kavanah is not going to add energy there. And it's almost like it's a nice place. Like, it's great that when I go after 120 years, I'm going to benefit in a certain way. Like, I put some money away in the bank and it's great for me. But like, what is it doing for the world? If it's really not related to the larger aspect of bringing Elokus into Gashmias, I think that's my question.
I don't understand the question, to be honest, but he said, in order to generate that energy, you have to do a mitzvah, also action. It just, there's two parts to the action. That means, look at it this way. I think I mentioned it a number of times. I'll say it again. If a person does mitzvahs mechanically, they do a good deed mechanical. They don't feel it. There's no passion. There's no vitality. There's nothing dynamic about it. In a way, they change the world, but in a very behavioral way, right? Like we're going to learn about behavioral. However, think of another person who does that same mitzvah in this world with passion, with vitality, with excitement, with fervor, and they excite everyone around them. Who's going to change their environment more? Obviously, the second one, because he has both qualities. So you need the Maisa because God wants us to work in this world. He doesn't want us to remain in spiritual realms. But a person who does a mitzvah with spirit and kavanah, their transformation is going to be far deeper. It's going to be more internalized, more integrated, and have much more impact. It would be like a person getting up and sharing a thought, but very dry and deadbeat. And, that's it. Another person getting up and giving this passionate talk. That's the difference. So Gan Eden is the place that stores that passion, that stores the kavanah. That's where it all comes alive. But without action, obviously, it's nothing. On the other hand, action without that has etzem, power, but it doesn't have the whole giluyim and the revelation. And
By the way, he started out this whole section saying, the very beginning, that he says just doing the action alone without kavanah does add or, but to the lower.
But now he's explaining. No, now he explained what he meant. That means with kavanah. He said kavanah, im kavanah, he said. The kavanah v'usa deliba. Read the third line at the top of the paragraph on page 1211. Dafka kasher nasim b'kavanah v'usa deliba. You see that?
Yeah.
Okay. You understood what I said?
Well, not exactly. You're talking the third line of the new paragraph of Lahavin.
Where you just said, where it's mamshich, that's what he says. Did you understand my explanation is what I'm asking you?
Before I asked my follow-up question, 100%. Yeah.
No, what I just explained now with passion and all that, that was the answer to the question.
No, because that's my question. He says here,
you're saying the kavanah v'usa deliba. Where are you reading?
No, the Hagam on page 12. Whatever,
and then he said, and he answered, Nira, that it's only with kavanah. That's what he answered. Anyway, read it again. You'll see. Okay. Now, let me see here.
Okay, I see. I understand your point now. Thank you.
I'll just sum up the end of the paragraph now, and then we'll stop. So then after the parentheses, he goes on and says, V'hinei, Omer Azal, schar mitzvah b'hal meleka, ki'im ba'elam habo. So he introduces now another Maimar Chazal, that there's no schar mitzvah in this world, only in the world to come. U'kamaimer kol Yisrael yeshlam chelik le'elam habo. Everyone has a share in the world to come. Afilu peishi Yisrael, shemalei mitzvahs karim, that he mentioned before in the parentheses. Everybody, even those that only have Maisa mitzvahs. So now he asks a question: how could you say that? Based on what we just learned, through mitzvahs, we increase energy in Gan Eden. Yeah, with Kavanah, but we increase energy in Gan Eden. So what do you mean that there's no schar in this world until Olam Habo? What about the schar in Gan Eden that we get, which precedes Olam Habo? Another question: and what is the difference between the two? Now we know by Olam Habo there'll be souls and bodies. So he's asking, what is the difference between the two? Now, if you're saying that neshamas begufim is the mila of Olam Habo, what's the quality? Neshamas without bodies, which benefit and enjoy the pleasures of the reflection of the Shekhinah, is higher than neshamas begufim because they're neshamas without gufim. So what's the mile of Olam Habo? And then another question. And the very statement that there is no reward in this world, we have to understand, doesn't the psukim, the Torah, filled with references that will have the time of reward of mitzvahs is in this world? Like it says in that when you'll follow the laws, God's laws, in my laws, God says, I will give you the rain in its time. And the earth will produce its produce. And if you don't listen, it tells you all kinds of negative things that will happen. And the pasuk, when you will listen, behold, I give you today the blessing. Today, meaning in this world. So how can you say that there's no schar in this world, only in the world to come? So a bunch of questions that he asks here. So now that we have a picture of what Gan Eden is, what Olam Habo is, we have to understand all these questions. And then some more questions. And we have to also understand, Razal say, these are the things that a person eats the fruit in this world, and the principle remains preserved for Olam Habo. In other words, we eat from the dividends and the interest, but the keren, the principle remains in Olam Habo. The choshev b'mishnah hey dvarim, and the Mishnah counts 5 things that we do eat from the fruit in this world. So we have to understand, first of all, we just said there's no reward in this world. So you say these 5, yes, why these 5 are distinguished from all the others? The kol mitzvahs scharim leka b'hayalma. Doesn't it say that schar mitzvah, but all the mitzvahs, we don't have schar in this world? Why are these 5 suddenly spelled out differently? Why are they distinguished with this, that you eat fruit from it in this world? He goes back to the original question. And Imbuchel Kaisa is also not saying several mitzvahs. Certainly he means all the mitzvahs get reward. Vaharaya, and the proof of that is, one proof, he brings Kibud Ava'im. He says, Laman Yarichun Yamecha. Says clearly, when you honor your parents, Shamat and Schara B'Tzida. The reward that is given is right there in the same verse. It tells us that when you're under a parent, you'll live long. Living long is not spiritual, it's physical in this world. You'll live long in the earth that I will give you. He's not talking about spiritual life, he's talking about physical life. So bottom line, bunch of questions now that emerge once we've established Gan Eden and Olam Habo. So it's true, we understand that the spiritual part of a mitzvah generates Olam Habo, a Gan Eden rather, and the Maisa is Olam Habo. But still, what's the difference between them? I mean, he hinted to it already, Mamala Kalam, Sevav Kalaman, and all the other questions about, is there reward in this world or there is no reward in this world? Which one is it? Now, the answer to these questions we've not yet gotten to, but we're about to get to on page 1272. But I'm going to stop here, and then I'll probably continue the review, which goes another little, not much more, and then we'll go back to 1271 and understand the whole subject. And we'll also understand why the Rebbe Rashab need 50 pages to explain all of this, before he gets back to the original point. Okay. So really, this was a review of page 1211 and 1212, even though it's really a review in order to understand 1271 and on. So that's how we'll sum up this section here. Okay. So we're going to stop here.
I love the way you're presenting it. I love the way you're presenting it. It's so good that you went back. I love it. Thanks.
Me too. It just goes to show you that the first time you go through a mimer, you really have not gotten it all. It's not possible, even if you think you understood it.
Yeah. No, I didn't. I mean, I knew more or less some of the ideas he's going to say, but not to the extent. Now you read back, you see how the Rebbe Rashab's brilliance, in his mind as he's writing this, he knows what he's going to be saying. He's like setting a stage. You also understand that Gan Eden and Olam Habo become more than just peripheral themes in Judaism. They're like essential to our whole transformation of existence. They're not just a sideshow here. It's part of the whole goal, objective of transforming the world into a Dira B'Tachtenim.
100%. Also,
Gan Eden, you don't really know what Gan Eden is until you learn this. Because Gan Eden sounds like one of these things, you know what? It's like a retirement village for those that learn Torah and did mitzvahs. Okay, you go to Gan Eden. The rest go to hell, and they go to sit in Gan Eden all day with an umbrella and sipping on whatever it is and learning Torah. That's what the general picture is. But it's a little more than that.
It was an excellent class.
Thank you. Listen, now that you all have become partners with me in Nosan the Gashmi, it's not just the Ruchnias. I have to deliver more.
For sure, it's happening.
Yeah.
Our Gashmias, we see our Gashmias turning into Ruchnias right in front of us.
Yeah, this is amazing stuff. It's such gewaldige stuff.
Very powerful.
I'm not just doing, by the way, for you. For me, it's also, I'm doing it for myself as well. Reviewing the whole thing and understanding the context. We go back to Gan Eden.
Yeah, but we benefit from you drawing the connections because you have a better picture of the whole thing. And when you draw the connections, it's really helping us make the connections.
Thank you. I see back to Gan Eden is back to 1254. Wow. Okay, great. So we're signing off. By the way, hey guys, I should let you know, I'm Farbrengen tonight. Zos Chanukah, it'll be streamed live.
Where can we find it?
I'm posting it right now.
Oh, Baruch Hashem. Where are you for bringing?
In Pomona.
California?
No. No. Pomona, New York. It's upstate. It's like, I don't know exactly where it is, to be honest. Okay. I'm
It's
posting
near
it right
Muncie, it's around that area.
We have a Pomona here in Southern California.
now. Okay. I just posted it.
Wonderful. Unity for bringing. Lovely.
Yeah.
You saw there's correspondence that we want to bring you out to Palo Alto for Yud Shvat.
Yeah. Great.
We're going to make it happen.
I think she pointed out Yud Shvat is Wednesday, not Thursday.
Yeah. I think she said it's Tuesday, not Wednesday, but whatever it is, it's
No. Yud Shvat is Wednesday.
Huh?
Yud Shvat is Wednesday.
Right. Correct.
So you want it for Wednesday night?
Correct.
Okay. Because I think initially wrote Thursday, the 13th. It's Wednesday, the 12th. Okay.
I think I may have had the number wrong, but the date I meant that we want the Fabringen Motzei Yud Shvat.
But you mean Wednesday night? Just spell that out because it was not clear.
Yeah, I'm going to call Avital right now, but yes.
Okay.
Not Erev Yud Shvat, but Motzei Yud Shvat.
But I need simple English. Is that Wednesday night? That's what you mean, right?
Yes, 100%.
Okay, good.
You want to bring your wife?
I don't bring her. She has to want to go.
Okay, well, I'll invite her. I'll tell Avital too, but you should know she wants a trip to California. That's part of the invitation.
Very much appreciated. We'll share with her for sure.
Okay, thank you so much, Rabbi.
Okay, great. So everybody have a great day. Great Hanukkah, actually. Happy Hanukkah. 7th day. One more tonight. Will be Shema Sos Hanukkah.
Does that mean we won't have a share on Yud Aleph Shvat?
It's a little while from now. I'll look it out. We'll work it out. I'm not sure if it's only Yitzchak, only Wednesday night, right? That means Thursday I'd go back.
Right, you'd have to give a shiur like me at 6:30 a.m. You see, it's not so easy.
But I mean, see, technically speaking, I would return Thursday, right?
Yeah. God's willing, you come in on Wednesday, whatever, maybe in the midday afternoon, because you're going to fly back in time, so you could leave late morning New York and still get here in the afternoon here, and then
Okay, we'll organize. We'll let you guys know. We'll let you know.
I mean, by the way, you're welcome to come as long as you like. If you want to enjoy California for a day or two, but if it's just business, 24 hours, yeah.
No, just wondering what's necessary. Then we can figure out the rest. I also have a daughter down in Southern California.
Yeah. So,
Rabbi Jacobson, you mentioned tonight is Shmini Atzeres. You started saying, but you took it back.
The Rebbe compared Shmini Atzeres compared to Zeis Chanukah.
I was wondering why you took it back. Because
I knew it would begin a whole new Fabringen.
Okay, it's worth it.
I'll Fabring tonight about it. Okay, guys.
Thank you so much.
A very good day. Freilich and Chanukah. See you tomorrow morning.
Happy Hanukkah. Yashkai.